I used to tell myself I was doing the right thing. For a long time, nothing bad happened, and that made the lie easy to live with. I thought I understood the rules. I thought distance and respect were enough. I thought if I stayed calm, stayed quiet, and stayed out of its way, I could keep everything from tipping over. What I did not understand back then is that protection can look like permission. And once something like that decides you have given permission, you do not get to take it back. I worked the woods in northern Michigan, the kind of country where the map is mostly green and the roads thin out into 2-track and logging cuts. The public sees it as vacation land cabins, lakes, fall colors, snowmobiles. The people who live here year-round see it differently. It is work. It is weather. It is long distances, broken cell service, and quiet that can swallow you if you are not used to it. I have spent most of my adult life out there. The job makes you notice patterns. You learn what a normal spring looks like and what a wrong spring feels like. You learn the difference between a bear that is moving through and a bear that is claiming a stretch of river. You learn where people trespass and when, which trails get used when the berries come in, which ridges get hit hard during deer season, which small lakes draw campers who do not know how fast the wind can change. It also teaches you that people create more problems than animals do. You can plan around weather. You can plan around black bears and coyotes. You cannot plan around a stranger who thinks the forest is a place with no rules. That is the part that mattered later. Back when this started, I thought being alone in the woods made me safer. I thought it gave me control. I was wrong. The first time I saw it was years ago, in late summer, when the heat still sat on the ground even after the sun dropped. I was working a routine sweep along an old logging spur that did not get much traffic. There had been complaints about dumping trash, old tires, things people did not want to pay to get rid of. So I was checking the pull-offs and the soft spots where trucks like to hide. I remember the air that day. Thick, still, the kind that carries every smell. Pine sap, damp soil, a hint of standing water from a low spot somewhere nearby. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I saw it at a distance first, across a stretch of young growth and brush. At first, my brain tried to make it into something normal. A bear standing up, a big man in a dark jacket, a trick of shadow and leaves. Then it shifted, just slightly, and everything snapped into place in my head in a way I did not want. The shape was wrong for a bear. Too tall, too narrow in the waist. The arms hung too long. The head sat forward in a way that made the silhouette look like it had a snout. It stood still, not crouched, not moving off, just standing there, like it had all day and all night to wait if it wanted to. I did not feel fear right away. It was more like disbelief, like my brain had paused because it could not decide which reality it lived in. I knew the stories. Everybody in Michigan knows somebody who knows somebody. You hear things about something big moving through swamp edges, about dogs acting strange on back roads, about a shape on a tree line that does not belong to a bear. I had always filed that stuff away as talk. People blowing up normal events because the woods can make you feel small and scared. But that day, the distance did not help. The stillness did not help. The way it watched, unmoving, did not help. It looked like an animal that did not need to hide because it had never been forced to. After a long minute, it turned without sound and stepped into the brush. No crashing, no snapping. It just vanished, like it had never been there. When I walked over later, after I had circled around and convinced myself I had to check, there was nothing. No clear tracks, no broken branches, no sign that matched the size I had seen. That should have been the end. A single weird moment I never told anyone. Something I shrugged off in my own head because it was easier. Instead, it became the start of a pattern. The next sighting happened months later, in early winter, before the deep snow settled in. I was out near a drainage where the cedars stayed thick and the ground stayed wet even when everything else had frozen. I had been following a line where hikers liked to cut off trail to reach a small lake. The area took a beating every year, trampled vegetation, fire scars, trash. That time, I did not see it across open brush. I saw movement between trees, a flash of dark body, a pale streak that might have been teeth, or maybe it was just snow caught on a muzzle. Then it held position, partly concealed, like it wanted me to see enough, but not too much. It felt intentional, the way it chose the distance. I stopped where I was. I listened. No wind. No birds. A kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I backed out without trying to be brave. I told myself that was professionalism, not fear. There is no benefit to pushing into something you do not understand. After that, sightings spaced themselves out. Sometimes months, sometimes a whole season. But they kept happening, and the details stayed consistent enough that I stopped believing it was a different animal each time. It was always alone, always watching, always the same build. Most of the time it stayed deep in the forest, far from the popular trails. That mattered. If it had been hanging around campsites or roads, it would have been a bigger problem fast. But it was not doing that. It seemed to have its own area and its own roots, like any other territorial animal. Over time, an unspoken understanding formed, and I hate admitting that, because it sounds like I am giving it human motives. But out there, you learn to read body language. You learn to read silence and presence. When I respected distance, nothing escalated. If I found signs that made the hair on my arms stand up, strong odor, weird scrapes on trees, an empty quiet in a place that should have been alive, I would change my route and move on. And then, in the weeks after, I would not see it. Almost like the forest was telling me, "Good, you understood." The problem was that I started to believe that meant I had control. The first time I did something that counts as protection, I did not call it that. I did not think I was protecting it. I thought I was protecting people. It was spring, and a group of shed hunters had been moving through an area that I knew, from my own time out there, was close to the places I had seen it. Shed hunters can be harmless. They can also be pushy, loud, and careless. They bushwhack everywhere. They leave scent and noise. They wander off trail because they think rules do not apply in the off-season. I found their boot tracks and their candy wrappers and the little bits of flagging tape they had tied to branches to mark their way back. The flagging bothered me more than the trash. Trash is stupid. Flagging is intention. It means they want to return. I pulled the tape down. I picked up what trash I could. I walked out and left no signs that anyone else had been there. I told myself it was standard. I told myself it was what I would do anyway. But I also knew I was pushing people away from a place I did not want them to be. That was the first step. Small, quiet, easy to justify. After that, I got more deliberate about it. If a trail crew was planning to improve a spur route into that section, I would suggest we focus on a different area that needed work. If a small group of campers asked about a quieter lake, I would point them toward a spot that could handle the traffic, not the wet, cedar-heavy back corner where the ground swallowed sound. I never told anyone why. I did not even tell myself why, not honestly. I framed it as conservation, as safety, as avoiding sensitive habitat. All of those reasons were partly true. They just were not the whole truth. At some point, it stopped being a coincidence that I kept people away. And at some point, it stopped being coincidence that it began appearing closer. The first shift was subtle. Daylight sightings became more common. The animal did not just vanish the moment I spotted it. It would hold position longer. It would watch for nearer cover. It would choose angles where I could see the outline of its head and shoulders more clearly. I remember one afternoon in early fall when the leaves had started to turn, but the undergrowth was still thick. I was walking a line along a creek, checking for illegal bait piles. I caught the smell before I saw anything, That wet dog musk mixed with something metallic and old. Then I saw it, standing on the far bank, not even trying to hide. It was not fully in the open, but it was not behind a tree either. The way it stood was calm, not hunched, not ready to flee. Its shoulders were high and slightly forward. The head angle made the snout clear. It looked more like a dog than any bear. Not a normal dog, not a wolf. Something taller, with a chest that looked built for strength, with arms that could hang and swing. It looked at me, and I felt that same mental pause. Not because it was mystical, but because it did not behave like an animal that feared people. It behaved like an animal that was deciding what people were worth. I backed away again. I left. I told myself that was the end of it. But on the drive home, the thought sat in my gut. It had let me see it. In the following weeks, I started expecting sightings. That is the part that still bothers me. Expectation turned something unknown into something routine. Routine makes you sloppy. I noticed it showed up after certain patterns, after a weekend where a lot of the TVs had been loud and reckless, after a rash of trespassing near a remote drainage, after I spent days in its area doing storm damage checks. It felt like it was monitoring the same human activity I was, tracking what changed, watching who entered, and how. And then, without me realizing when it happened, I started feeling watched even when I did not see it. The woods can do that to you. You can convince yourself you are being watched because you are alone and your mind gets jumpy. But this was different. It came with physical signs. Tracks in soft spots that did not match bare. Branches bent and pressed down at heights above a man's head. Fresh scrapes on bark that looked like something had leaned its weight in. I began to accept it as normal. I began to accept it as part of the area, like you accept that a river will flood in spring. That acceptance is what made my second protection choice feel reasonable. It happened during a warm stretch in late fall, after the first snow had melted off and the ground turned soft again. A group of guys had driven trucks down a closed logging spur. They were hauling equipment too much for casual camping. I could see the ruts they left, the way the road edges had been chewed up, the tire tracks in the wet spots. I followed the sign and found where they had set up. A rough camp, a fire ring, fresh-cut branches used as seats, a cooler, a pile of scrap that looked like it came from a salvage yard, and in the center, a bait pile corn, grease, and meat scraps, illegal, dangerous, the kind of thing that turns bears into problems and gets people hurt. I tore the camp apart the way you do when you have authority and you are trying to make a point. I removed the bait. I scattered the fire ring. I dragged the trash bags and the scrap to my truck and hauled it out. I blocked the road with deadfall and rocks on the way back, making it harder for them to return without effort. I told myself it was normal enforcement. But the truth is, I was doing it because I did not want them in that spot, not because of the bears. I did not want them close to the area where the dogmen moved. That is the word people use, and it is the only one that fits. Dogman. It sounds like a joke until you see something tall with a muzzle, until you smell that wet, musky stink in a place that should smell like pine and water. After that incident, the dogman no longer avoided me. The next time I saw it, it was closer than it had ever been. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that the details stopped being guesses. The fur was dark, not pure black, but deep brown with lighter streaks in places where the sun hit. The legs were thick and angled like a canine's, but the posture was upright, balanced. The arms hung like a man's arms, but the hands were bigger than any hands I had ever seen in the woods, and the fingers looked built to grip. The head was the most unsettling part. The snout was clear, the muzzle long, the mouth line tight. The ears sat up higher than I expected, not floppy, not like a bear's. It looked like something that belonged on all fours, but it stood like it had decided it could own the vertical world too. It held eye contact, and it did not move away first. I felt something in my chest, and that I did not name. It was not friendship. It was not trust. It was the feeling you get when an animal stops running and starts measuring you. I left again. I went home. I tried to sleep. That winter, I started making choices I never talked about. If I heard about someone planning a night hunt on the edge of the forest, I would make sure patrols were heavier in that area. If I found fresh shell casings near a remote trailhead, I would keep an eye on it and push people out sooner. I stopped sharing certain details with coworkers. Not lies, exactly, but omissions. I would talk about safety, about weather, about sensitive habitat. I would not talk about the reason my stomach nodded when I saw headlights on a closed road. It is hard to explain how that becomes a habit. You convince yourself you are preventing harm, and maybe you are. But you are also stepping into a role you did not earn. The boundary shifts continued. In early spring, during thaw, I found tracks near places I had never seen them before. Not deep in the cedar swamp, not along the back ridges. Closer to the managed edges places, where cut lines met older growth, places where public trails ran. One morning I found a set of prints in a soft, muddy patch near a maintenance road. Big, deep. The toes were not bare toes. The shape had that long forward push like a foot that rolled. I stood over them for a long time. The prints were not random. They ran along the road for a stretch and then stepped off into the trees at a spot where the brush was thick and visibility poor. It was using the road the way people use roads, to move easier, to cover ground. That was when the first warning happened. I was walking a familiar path near a drainage I had used for years. It was a quiet corridor, a place I knew well. Halfway down, where the trail narrowed between thick brush, it stood, fully visible, unmoving, not crouched, not hiding. The dogman filled the space, tall enough that the brush around it looked short. Its shoulders were squared. Its arms hung down, but the tension was in the posture. It did not growl. It did not bark. It did not need to. It simply blocked the path and held still until my body understood what my brain was trying not to accept. It was telling me no. I stood there longer than I should have. I tried to read it the way you read a bear's ears or a wolf's tail, but it was not giving me those signals. It was giving me the signal of presence, the signal of ownership. Eventually, I backed out and rerouted. I told myself I had read it right. I told myself that was the correct response. What I did not do was accept what that meant. I should have stopped then. I should have walked away from the whole thing, kept my work to the public areas, stayed with other staff, stayed on roads, avoided the back corridors entirely. Instead, I made the critical mistake. The mistake was not meeting the dogman. The mistake was staying involved. It happened during early summer when everything is green and the bugs are thick and people flood north because they think nature is a theme park. It started with small report shots heard after dark near a stretch that should have been quiet. Trucks on closed roads, a few campers complaining about strange noises. On its own, that would have been normal. People do dumb things every summer, but something about the pattern bothered me. The reports clustered around the same corridor, the same drainage, the same back corner where I had seen it. I started checking more often. I ran the roads late. I walked in early. I watched for fresh tire tracks. I looked for beer cans and fire scars. I did the work that keeps small problems from turning into big ones. And one evening, just after dusk, I found what I had been looking for. A makeshift camp in a clearing that did not have a trail leading to it. Fresh vehicle sign. A couple of coolers. A stack of bags. A smell of fuel and grease. And off to the side, a set of steel traps. Not little leg-hold traps for raccoon. Heavy traps. The kind people use when they are trying to catch something they think is a threat, or something they think is worth money. I felt cold all over when I saw them, even though the air was warm. I disabled what I could. I covered the traps in a way that would make them obvious. I took pictures for documentation. I scattered the camp. I hauled out what I could. Then, because I felt like I had to do more, I went further than I should have. I stayed in the area after dark. I told myself I was waiting for the guys to come back so I could confront them in a professional way, with backup in the morning if needed. But that is not the truth. The truth is that I felt responsible. I felt like I had already stepped into this, so I had to finish it. The woods at night in summer are not silent. They hum. Bugs, frogs, wind. But that night, as full darkness settled, the noise thinned out in a way that made my throat tighten. I heard something move at a distance, not a deer, not a small animal. Heavy steps that did not crash, but did not hide either. A weight shift in brush, a soft sound like breath. Then I caught the odor again, stronger than ever, like wet fur left in the sun. I did not see it right away. I felt it, a sense of being watched, but closer now, tighter, like the circle had shrunk. When it finally stepped into view, it was too close for comfort. Not on top of me, but close enough that I could see muscle under fur, close enough that the shape of its muzzle and the line of its teeth in the dim light were not guesses. It did not look curious that night. It looked tense. The body language was different. The shoulders were higher. The stance was wider. The stillness felt like a held breath, not calm. I froze. I knew better than to run. Running tells an animal you are prey. But standing still did not feel like a solution either. It moved a step forward, slow, deliberate. Not a charge. Not a threat display. A step that said, "This is my space, and you are here." I backed away. One step, then another. I kept my eyes on it without staring too hard. I moved until brush was between us, until I could retreat without turning my back completely. It did not follow right then. It did not have to. The message was already delivered. After that night, everything shifted. The courtesy of distance was gone. The idea that I could choose when and where I saw it was gone. It began appearing without warning, not far away, close enough that it changed the way I moved. I started finding signs near my own work site scrapes on trees beside the access roads, a smell near a storage shed that did not belong there, a line of prints in a soft patch near a culvert. Then it started showing up near the edges of my own place. I live modest, like a lot of people up here. A small home near a service road, close enough that I can reach problem areas quickly. A garage, a shed, nothing fancy. Enough space to store gear and keep tools dry. One morning, I stepped out and found tracks in the wet dirt beside my shed. They were huge, clear, fresh. The prints came up along the tree line and stopped near the corner of the building, like something had stood there and listened. Then the prints turned and walked away, not toward the woods, but along the edge of my yard, following the line where my place met the forest. I stood there staring at them until my skin crawled. That was when fear replaced familiarity. It is one thing to know something is out there in the deep woods. It is another to know it has walked up to your structures in the morning. I started changing routines, small changes at first. I stopped leaving things outside. I stopped walking to my truck in the dark without a light. I kept the windows covered at night. I told myself it was caution, but it was more than that. It felt like I was adapting to a new set of rules, rules I had not agreed to. The DOGMAN dictated timing now. It decided when I would see signs. It decided when I would smell it. It decided when the woods would go quiet. And the worst part was that it was not openly hostile. It was not attacking livestock. It was not chasing people on trails. If it had done anything loud and violent, I could have responded the way you respond to a threat, with documentation and protocol. Instead, it asserted ownership with presence. That is harder to fight. By the second year after that first sighting, the job and the animal had started sharing a calendar in my head. When the snow came early and the lakes froze fast, I would see fewer human tracks in the back corners, and I would also see fewer signs of it. When spring thaw hit and the first waves of morel hunters and shed hunters wandered in, the signs would come back scrapes on cedar trunks, trails through brush that looked pressed down by something heavier than a deer, spots where the forest floor was turned over like something had pawed at it with big hands. I started paying attention to details I would have ignored before. If an area went quiet, I did not just think about predators the way you normally would. I thought about pressure. I thought about what had changed. A long weekend of loud campers. A new informal trail cut by mountain bikes. A logging crew operating farther back than usual. Human noise shifts the whole forest, and whatever that dogman was, it felt like it tracked those shifts the way a seasoned ranger does. The odd thing is that it never acted like it was hunting people. I know the difference between being stalked and being observed. Predators that want to feed do not waste time showing themselves in clean sight lines. They take angles. They set up. They wait for mistakes. This felt more like being watched by something that wanted to understand you, or maybe just wanted you to understand it. That is where the dependence started, and I did not catch it until it had already grown roots. If I went weeks without seeing sign, I would feel relief at first. Then the relief would twist into a kind of alertness, like I had lost track of a storm I had been monitoring. I would find myself scanning tree lines for no reason. I would step off trail to check a soft patch for prints. I would smell the air like a dog, trying to catch something that was not there. I told myself it was just good field sense. I told myself it meant I was tuned in. But there was another truth under it. I had started to believe this animal knew me specifically. I had started to believe my choices mattered to it. That is a dangerous thought, because once you believe you matter to something wild, you start taking responsibility for it. There were practical moments that fed that belief. One summer, a couple of teenagers decided to build a rope swing on a creek bend deep in the forest. They hauled in a ladder and a cooler and left beer cans in the sand. I found it on a routine patrol and started taking it down, not because I hate fun, but because that spot had undercut banks and a nasty snag just below the surface. It was a broken neck waiting to happen. While I was working, I felt that same pressure in the air. I turned and saw it in the trees across the creek, partly hidden. It was not close, but it was close enough that it was clearly watching what I was doing. That was the first time I noticed something that stuck with me. It did not watch me like a deer watches you, nervous and ready to bolt. It watched like it was evaluating the situation. Like it understood I was altering the environment. Like it understood the rope swing and the noise and the trash were changes. When I hauled the ladder out and erased the trampled path back to the creek, the sense of presence eased. The woods did not feel as tight. I did not see it again that day. I told myself that was coincidence. But later that week, I found no fresh sign near that corridor. It was like the animal had stepped back again. Another time, in late October, I caught wind of a small group planning to run dogs after dark on public land. Not legal, not safe, and it turns animals into chaos. I set up a patrol line on access points and kept vehicles moving through the area for hours. People hate that kind of presence. They want the woods to be empty so they can do what they want. The next morning, in the soft mud beside a culvert, I found a line of prints crossing the road, huge, clean impressions that did not look like bear and did not look like human boots. They crossed from one side to the other and then ran along the road for a short stretch before cutting into the trees. It looked like the animal had monitored the patrol line the way I monitored the road. The longer it went, the more I treated it like a neighbor with a boundary rather than a mystery. I started thinking in terms of keeping the peace. That is how the protection became a pattern without me noticing. I got used to steering people away with small, plausible reasons. A washout up the trail. A downed tree that makes it rough going. A nesting area that could use a break. A bridge that is sketchy after rain. The kinds of things you say as a ranger because you actually do want people safe. Sometimes I would go out ahead of busy weekends and remove new flagging tape or scatter firewood someone had stacked in a spot that suggested they planned to return. If a group had built a rough bench or a marker out of stones, I would break it down not out of spite, but because those small improvements turn into permanent human footprint. A part of me knew I was doing something different. I was cleaning up human presence faster than necessary, deeper than my assigned routes. I told myself it was proactive management. Then the dogman began pushing its own boundary. It would show up along the edge of a trail I used to consider safe. I would smell it downwind when I had never smelled it near that corridor before. Once, in midsummer, I was checking a culvert after a thunderstorm, and I found a fresh clump of dark fur snagged on a broken branch at shoulder height. Not deer fur. Not bear. Coarse, long strands, almost like guard hair. I did not take it. I did not bag it. I did not want to make myself more involved. I left it there and walked away. But that night, I could not stop picturing it. There were also small moments that felt like tests. I would find a sapling bent over at waist height across a faint path that only staff used. Not a tree downed by wind. A young tree pressed and held down, pinned by something heavy. You could step over it, but it forced you to slow down, forced you to look at the ground and the sides, forced you to notice you were being redirected. Once I found a dead squirrel laid on the edge of a two-track where it did not belong. Not eaten, not torn apart, just placed. Maybe it was nothing. The woods are full of dead animals. But it sat in the center of the track, as if something wanted it to be seen, like a marker. I started feeling like the animal was reshaping my roots, the same way I was reshaping other people's. That realization should have scared me enough to stop. Instead, it fed the worst part of my thinking. It fed the idea that there was a shared understanding. That is what people do when they cannot handle uncertainty. They build narratives. By the time the dogman was showing up near managed edges, I had already convinced myself of something I never said out loud, that as long as I kept trouble out of its area, it would keep trouble away from mine. It is embarrassing to admit, but that is the truth. I believed in a balance that was never agreed to. The truth is, the woods do not care about your balance. Animals do not sign contracts. And anything intelligent enough to watch you is intelligent enough to use you if you let it. There was one incident that still plays back in my head because it shows how far I had drifted. A family had set up a small camp near a state forest boundary, not deep in the backcountry, but close enough to the corridor that it made my stomach tighten. Their site was legal, and they were doing everything right fire in a ring, food stored, kids staying near the tent. They were not the problem. The problem was the late-night noise that showed up down the road. A truck idling, doors slamming, voices carrying in the still air. I drove down and found two men setting up lights and a speaker, talking about luring coyotes. It was a sloppy plan and an unsafe spot. I shut it down. I escorted them out. I stayed in the area longer than I needed, making sure they did not circle back. When I returned to the family's camp near midnight to check in from a distance, I noticed the dogs had gone silent. They had a small dog on a lead earlier in the day, a yappy thing that had barked at everything. Now it was silent, pressed close to the tent, trembling. The adults were awake. I could tell by the dim light and the way the tent fabric shifted. I did not approach. I did not want to spook them. I just stood in the dark for a minute and listened. From the tree line behind their camp, I heard one heavy step in the leaves, slow and careful. The smell rolled over the campsite like a wave. I never saw the dogman that night, but I felt the presence of it so clearly that my legs wanted to move without me telling them to. I repositioned myself between the camp and the trees, not in a dramatic way, just a few steps, just enough to feel like I was not letting something come closer. I stayed there for 10 minutes, maybe 15, listening. The forest behind the camp stayed quiet. Then the pressure eased and the smell faded, like the thing had backed off. The next morning, the family packed up early and left. They did not file a report. They did not complain. They just left. I told myself I had prevented something. But the truth is, I had placed myself between people and an animal I could not control. And in doing that, I was acting out the same role I had been acting out deeper in the woods. That is not protection. That is participation. And participation is what changes the rules. After that summer, the dogman's presence near my life became more regular. It was not constant, but it was enough that I stopped feeling like my home was a separate world. I would walk out to take the trash and smell it faintly on the air. I would find the fence line disturbed, not broken, just pressed down, like something had leaned over it. I would hear a soft, heavy movement along the brush line at night, and then nothing. I started sleeping lighter. I stopped leaving the bedroom window cracked. I kept the porch light off, because light can make you feel safe while also making you visible. I also started noticing how my own behavior was changing in ways that had nothing to do with policy or procedure. I would avoid sitting on the porch after dark. I would park my truck closer to the house, so I did not have to walk a long distance through the yard. I would choose routes to work that kept me on open roads, even if they took longer. These are small things, but small things add up to a life being shaped by something you do not talk about. I did not tell coworkers. I did not tell friends. I did not tell anyone because I knew what would happen. They would think I was stressed or lonely or losing perspective. And maybe they would have been right, because a secret like that makes you spin in your own head. So I kept it quiet and kept doing what I thought was necessary to keep people away from the back corner. And each time I did that, the dogman seemed to claim a little more space. I did not see it as a bargain at the time. I saw it as a pattern that was working. The trouble with patterns is that when they fail all at once. The breaking point came in late fall, when the nights started getting cold and the daylight shrank. I had been keeping my work closer to public areas, staying on main trails, avoiding the back corridors that used to be routine for me. I told myself I was still doing my job, just smarter. Then a call came in about a missing hunter. Not a serious missing person at first, more like someone overdue. Car at a trailhead, no contact, family anxious. Those calls happen. People get turned around. Batteries die. The woods are bigger than they think, but the location hit me in the gut. The trailhead was on the edge of the corridor I had tried to keep quiet for years. We did the normal steps. We checked the car. We checked the first mile of trail. We fanned out. We listened for whistles and calls. I kept my mouth shut about why my hands were shaking. During the search, I found something that made my stomach drop. Not a body. Not blood. Something worse in a different way. A line of prints crossing the trail. Big, upright, fresh. They moved from deeper in the woods toward the trail, then turned and walked parallel to it, like something had been pacing the searchers without wanting to be seen. I said nothing. I did not need to. The hairs on my neck were already up. The hunter turned up the next day, alive, cold, embarrassed. He had gotten turned around and spent the night in a low spot where the wind did not hit as hard. He told a story about hearing something move in the brush, about feeling watched, about a smell like wet fur. Everybody shrugged it off as nerves and cold. That is how those stories go. But I heard what he did not say, and I felt something settle in my chest. The dogman was not just watching me anymore. It was close enough to watch other people too. That night I did not sleep. I sat inside, lights off, watching the window line, listening to the forest beyond my property. The wind moved through the trees. The normal sounds came and went. Then, around midnight, I smelled it. It came on the air like a wave. Wet dog. Old meat. Damp earth. The scent of something that sleeps outside. I stepped to the window and looked through a small gap in the curtain. It stood at the edge of my yard where the trees began, fully visible in the pale light from the sky. It did not move. It did not need to. It stood there long enough that my brain started trying to look away, like my eyes wanted to protect me from what they were seeing. A dogman held that position until I backed away from the window, not running, just retreating. Only then did it step back into the trees. That was the moment I understood I no longer controlled the interaction. It was not an animal passing through. It was not a rare sighting. It was part of my daily reality now, and it knew exactly where I lived. After that, consequences stacked up quickly. I stopped going into the woods alone unless I absolutely had to. I timed my work to daylight. I asked for another unit on patrols I used to do solo. That kind of change gets noticed. People ask questions. You come up with reasons. I told people I was being careful because of trespassers. I told people I had seen signs of a large bear. I kept it simple because complicated stories get laughed at. But the truth sat under everything. I had tried to protect something that did not need me, and in doing that, I had shifted the boundary between us. The final encounter happened on a cold morning in early winter, right after the first real snow. The kind of snow that covers everything clean, makes the world look new, makes tracks stand out like ink on paper. I had woken before dawn, restless, because I had spent weeks living with the feeling of being monitored. I stepped outside with a light and walked the edge of my yard, checking for prints the way you check for fresh ice. The snow told the story immediately. Tracks had come right up to the side of my house. Not just the yard edge, right up to the wall. The prints stopped beneath my kitchen window. It had stood there in the night, close enough that if I had looked out, I would have been looking straight down at it. I followed the tracks with my light, slow, careful, like I was tracking an animal that could turn and decide it was done with me. The prints led away toward the tree line, but they did not go deep. They looped. They circled the property. They crossed my own boot tracks from the day before, like it had been studying where I moved. Then, near the back corner where the brush thickened, the tracks ended, and I felt it before I saw it. A presence. A shape that made the darkness feel heavier. It stood there, partially in cover, but close enough that the light caught the line of its muzzle and the curve of its chest. The eyes reflected just slightly, not like a deer's bright shine, more like a dull glint. It did not step forward. It did not retreat. It held eye contact longer than it ever had. That long look did something to me. It was not anger. It was not curiosity. It felt final, like a decision had been made, and I was not part of making it. I realized then what my protection had been interpreted as. I had discouraged people from entering its area. I had dismantled camps. I had removed traps. I had altered human behavior in a way that likely benefited it. From my side, that was safety. From its side, that may have looked like service, like an agreement, like a submission to its space. I had rewritten boundaries without consent. I had acted like I could manage something wild and intelligent, and the wild thing had responded by moving closer, by tightening its claim. In that moment, I understood there was no undoing it. You cannot explain yourself to something that is not part of your world. You cannot bargain with an animal that has already decided what you are. I backed away slowly, the way I always did. One step, then another. My boots squeaked in the snow. My breath came out in clouds. It stayed still until I reached the edge of my yard. Then it turned and walked away, not fast, not slow, just steady, like it knew I would not chase. When it disappeared into the trees, the woods around it went quiet for a long moment, like the forest had been waiting for it to move. That day I made a decision that did not feel brave. It felt like surrender, but it was the only thing that made sense. I requested a transfer to a different district, not far enough to change my whole life, but far enough to break the daily pattern. I told the supervisors it was for professional reasons. Better coverage, better schedule. I did not mention anything else. In the weeks before the move, I kept to myself. I packed quietly. I avoided the back corridors entirely. I did not tell friends the real reason because I did not want anyone curious. Curiosity is what gets people hurt in places like this. On my last night at that house, I sat inside with the lights low and listened to the wind. Snow ticked against the window. The heater kicked on and off, the normal sounds of a small life. Then, sometime after midnight, I smelled it one last time. Not as strong as before, not right up against the house, more like it was passing the edge and reminding me it was there. I did not go to the window. I did not check the yard. I did not try to confirm anything. I stayed still and let the moment pass. In the morning, I left before full daylight. I loaded the truck, checked the locks, and drove out without lingering. I did not look back at the tree line. I have not gone back to that corridor since. I do not hike it for fun. I do not visit old spots. I do not take friends there. I do not talk about it around campfires. The woods in Michigan are big enough that you can avoid a place if you choose to. But avoiding it is not the same as forgetting it. The lesson I learned is simple, and it is not comforting. Protection is not control. Respect is not a contract. And coexistence is not something you can manage once you step past watching and start acting like you belong in the middle of it. I do not know if the dogman ever turned hostile. I do not know if it ever hurt anyone. What I know is that it asserted ownership, and it did it in a way that left me no room to argue. The worst part is this: it did not chase me away with violence. It did not do anything that would make a clean story for other people to believe. It simply moved closer, rewrote the boundaries, and made sure I understood that my life was now on the edge of its territory. I left because leaving was the only boundary I had left to choose. And even now, years later, when I step into a quiet stretch of forest and the air feels too still, I remember that first lie. I remember how easy it was to believe I was helping. And I remember how quickly help became permission. People ask why I never filed some big report, why I never pushed it higher, why I never tried to prove anything. The answer is simple. My job was never to prove legends. My job was to keep people safe and keep the forest from being damaged by the worst parts of human behavior. Once I understood I had lost control, the safest thing I could do was remove myself from the pattern. I could not make the dogman leave. I could not make it forget me. The only thing I could change was my own presence. Even now, in a different district, I still catch myself doing the same checks. If a stand of trees goes too quiet, I slow down. If the air carries that heavy, damp animal smell on a cold morning, my stomach tightens before my mind can argue. Sometimes I wake up and for a second I expect to see tracks in fresh snow outside my door. I do not tell that to anyone because it sounds like superstition. But it is not superstition when you have lived it. It is memory. If there is one thing I would tell anyone who works in remote places, it is this: you do not make deals with the wild, even silent ones. You do not help something you do not understand and then assume it will interpret your help the way you meant it. The forest does not reward good intentions. It rewards distance and humility. I thought I was protecting something for years. All I really did was teach it where I lived.